What's the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Story 1. Was working the evening shift at a gas station. A man came in all disoriented. I went to help him out. He had a gash on his head and did not know where he was. I could not see any crashes around, so assumed he had fallen or something. Normally, we are supposed to stay inside the glass-shielded register area whenever anyone is in the store. I, being a decent human being, went to help while calling the police and emergency medical services. They arrived and checked him out. They thought his head might have been seriously injured. Took him to the emergency room. I went back to work. Officers stopped back by for some coffee a few hours later. They told me the man got hit by a baseball bat while trying to break into a young girl's bedroom and was wanted for serious crimes in 2 other states. I never left the register area at night again. Story 2. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them passed away on impact, and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before passing away. This was in the 1960s, so medical care was not what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. Story 3. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby caused the deaths of 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to harm herself. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug activity and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming in to 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash destroyed both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. Debris was scattered across the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. Story 4. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big, strange house on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a major restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I had forgotten to take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs, I looked, and there was a large, shadowy male figure toward the bottom of the staircase. I panicked, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months, I did not tell my family because I was sure what I had seen was a ghost and did not think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800 to $900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how anyone could have gotten in. Turns out someone was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst and most terrifying moments I have ever had. Story 5. I will tell you one that happened to me, or rather, one I witnessed. One night I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came speeding past the bar. The car went through a red light and started going up a hill that was on a curve. We watched as the driver veered over the double yellow and collided head-on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars lifted up in the back and then slammed down. The car that had been driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and report that there had been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and I ran to the cars. I had always thought it was a fictional trope, but I was fairly drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were overwhelming, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part, and what stays with me, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she passed away. It was the most haunting sound. The fire department arrived and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The reckless driver was a wealthy, intoxicated man. He lost a leg but was otherwise physically unharmed. I have no idea if he served any time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I have tried to find a link to the news story, but I cannot, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Low HUD and Channel 12 News. Story 6. Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a public relations disaster happened that also emotionally affected a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical businesses, such as care homes, and cleaned them, and you can imagine the heavy-duty washing, bleaching, and boiling needed to remove biological contaminants. One day, a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching and boiling cycle before it dropped onto a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying and pressing when there was a horrified scream. A small newborn baby's body had been discovered tangled among the sheets, and the intense washing process had destroyed it. The laundry workers were devastated. The whole place had to be shut down. The police were called, and the laundry was tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turned out a stillborn baby had been left in the cot, waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes, covered with a blanket. But somehow one of the nurses did not realize this, most likely because she had just started her shift and grabbed all the linen out of the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry trolley. The other nurses and the parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored while they made funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be at fault, but the parents were heartbroken and the hospital received serious criticism. The laundry workers who discovered the body ended up getting counseling before eventually quitting. The company later changed its process to individually emptying each laundry hamper instead of tipping them in to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Story 7. My wife arrived at her parents' house, where she was living due to her father's health issues. She got into the house, no one else was home, and instead of going deeper inside, she stopped in the first room near the door, the one that held the computers. She went inside and was browsing the internet when one of the cats entered, her own cat to be exact. This cat was extremely relaxed, loved everyone, and never became aggressive. He would literally lie down and let squirrels throw pecans at him from trees without reacting. Not this night, however, because he was growling and hissing off and on while standing between my wife and the entrance to the rest of the house. A usually calm and sweet old cat was acting like he was ready to attack. My wife realized this was extremely strange, so she picked up her cat and left the house. As soon as she walked outside, she saw a police car patrolling down her street and flagged them down. She explained the situation, and they firmly told her to stay in their cruiser while they checked the house. They found the back door wide open, which was alarming because her parents never left it unlocked, let alone open. Later, she learned from the officers that they were searching for a dangerous offender who had been spotted in the area, which was why they were patrolling a normally quiet residential street. It was deeply unsettling. Story 8. Have you heard of the man so violent that other members of the regime he served in, including fellow SS officers, repeatedly tried to have him and his unit disbanded and arrested? His name was Oscar Derlewanger, and his unit was known as the Black Hunters or the Derlewanger Brigade. Oscar Derlewanger was an early supporter of the regime and had previously been imprisoned for harming minors. When the war began and large numbers of soldiers were dying on the Eastern Front, his old acquaintance Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him command of a unit originally made up of poachers and later expanded with civilian criminals and military offenders. His unit was designated as a rearguard force meant to hunt down enemy partisans, although in many cases their actions targeted civilians in occupied territories. The Derlewanger unit committed countless atrocities, some so extreme that other SS units filed reports against them. One widely documented example involved forcing an entire village in Belarus into a church, locking the doors and setting the building on fire, shooting anyone who tried to escape. During the Warsaw Uprising, they were sent to suppress resistance, and one of their actions involved entering a children's hospital, pretending to secure it, and then assaulting the female staff and some of the wounded girls before killing everyone inside. Survivors were harmed further to ensure they did not live. Their brutality was so severe that even other members of the regime despised them, but despite numerous complaints, their unit remained active. By the end of the war, the brigade was destroyed, and its leaders and members were hunted down and brought to justice. Story 9 told this here before, but once more, my friend had a neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on properties with large front lawns and long driveways, and the neighbor kept a couple of old cars near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he went to the window, there would be nothing there, so he assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote. The noise kept happening, so he would go outside to look around but still find nothing. He put out traps and occasionally caught animals, yet the noise persisted. Soon he claimed he was hearing whispers coming from the front yard. He would go outside and walk around the perimeter of his property, but continued to find nothing. The issue became so persistent that he started calling the police. But every time they checked, they found nothing and eventually told him to stop calling and maybe get a security camera. The man thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening, he could not sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of the house. He put out his cigarette, snuck around to the front, and arrived just in time to see the doors of his old conversion van silently close. He ran back inside and called the police to report what he had seen. The officers arrived without lights or sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and several people ran out in different directions. Upon searching the van, the police found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people had been using the vehicle as a place to take illicit substances. Story 10. I have posted this before, but here is mine. When I was a baby, my dad played on a softball team. It was a typical social team, with beers and pizza after games, a family-friendly kind of thing. My parents were good friends with two of the other couples, and both couples had young kids. On this particular day, the two couples left their kids at one of their houses with a babysitter they were sharing. They invited my parents back to the house to have more drinks afterward, but I was fussy that night and my mom decided they should just go home, even though they almost always went to hang out. My fussiness that day ended up saving our lives. When the other parents returned to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. Two men had broken in, tied up the kids, the babysitter, and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents to return. They took the parents hostage as well and forced the dads to drive them to banks and to a grocery store where one dad was a manager, making them empty accounts in a safe. After that, they returned to the house and took the lives of both entire families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, including the children. The two men were caught later. My dad attended the trials and said it was the only time he ever considered supporting the death penalty. It still chills me to know how close we came to being there that night. Story 11. The Battle of Oswiec Fortress in 1915 involved German troops attempting to use gas to force out the Russian defenders, as the fort had been a major obstacle since the beginning of the war. The gas attack succeeded in killing almost 3 full companies, and the Germans advanced across the fields expecting the fortress to be empty and victory to be easy. From within the fortress, Russian soldiers emerged, coughing up blood and lung fragments, covered in bandages improvised as gas masks, and suffering chemical burns. They returned rifle and light artillery fire at the advancing Germans. The German troops did not bother firing back at first and instead ran back to their lines. Their commanders claimed the defenders were already dead and told them to wait 20 minutes and then take the place, to which the soldiers replied that it was not men protecting the fortress, but something far more terrifying. Osijek Fortress never fell during the war, as when German troops returned months later, the defenders had been replaced with fresh forces. This story may be different from others, but it remains one of the most haunting for me. Story 12. I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed odd things happening, a batch of soup disappearing faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she had not used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, and similar weird details. This went on for months and she assumed she was becoming forgetful. One day she heard thumping in her attic and went to investigate. She found makeshift living quarters including a small radio, a hot plate, a sleeping bag, a pillow, and food wrappers. She called the police, who kept an eye on the place. They eventually caught a homeless man climbing a tree near the house, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost every day, waiting for her to leave for work before going downstairs to help himself to food and amenities. The strange part is they eventually got to know each other, and he turned out to be respectful and simply down on his luck. She did not press charges and instead let him move in temporarily, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. A creepy situation with a surprisingly positive ending. Story 13. My mom did not tell me this story for a long time, probably so she would not worry me unnecessarily when I was young. My parents split up when I was about 4 years old, and my mom and my sisters stayed in a small townhouse for a few years before moving in with my stepdad. While we were living in that townhouse for less than a year, my mom heard something in her room in the middle of the night. When she woke up to check, there was a man standing in her room. She gasped loudly and jumped out of bed, torn between running to our room or confronting him because she was full of adrenaline. The man ran out the back door, and when the police arrived, they found signs of forced entry. She never told us the full story while we were little because we had slept through all of it, but she explained more as we got older. Story 14. Before my dad passed away, he told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He described a mission where he and one other American, along with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were assigned to place seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. After about 2 days, he and 2 of the strikers split from the main group to watch a nearby trail intersection. The jungle was quiet that day with only birds, insects, and occasional monkeys. They had been watching for 3 or 4 hours, deciding whether to move down the trail or turn back and regroup. Before leaving cover, my dad checked the trail one last time and prepared his men to move. This is where the story becomes unusual. Just as he stepped toward the trail, he saw a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear lying beside the trail. The soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a short curved club at his side. As my dad processed what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him, smiled, and slowly put a finger to his lips as if to tell him to stay quiet, then motioned him back into the brush. My dad signaled his men to remain hidden, and as he slipped back into the jungle on one side, the soldier did the same on the opposite side. Less than 10 seconds later, the lead element of a large group of North Vietnamese army soldiers walked through the intersection about 30 feet away. My dad estimated 70 to 80 soldiers armed with automatic rifles, light machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He had no doubt they would have all been killed instantly. After the enemy passed, he and his team quickly retreated and rejoined their patrol. He reported the enemy contact but chose not to mention the soldier he had seen. He kept the secret for many years, telling only me shortly before he died and telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. When he told her, she smiled and said, without opening her eyes, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather, a half-black, half-Creek free man who scouted for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served in the U.S. Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle, and a Creek war club into battle. Story 15. A bunch of girls in my friend group decided to have a night out and ended up at the local gay club. I cannot remember why I did not go, and although I am relieved I was not there, I also wish I had been so I could have helped. They noticed a girl on the dance floor who looked completely out of place. She was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, had no makeup on, her hair was in a ponytail, and she had a backpack. It was the opposite of what people usually wore to that club. They also said she seemed very dazed, and more importantly, a large man was grabbing her and pressing up against her while she just stood there not reacting. One of my friends approached her to ask if she was okay, but the man answered for her, insisting he was her boyfriend and that she had simply had too much to drink. Everyone was suspicious, but there was not much they could do except keep an eye on them. Eventually, the man left the dance floor to go to the bar, and my friend managed to talk to the girl again. She said the girl was extremely out of it, and it seemed more likely she had been drugged than drunk. The girl managed to say she did not know the man and wanted to leave. My friend grabbed her and headed for the exit, but the man returned immediately. He became furious, got in my friend's face, and screamed at her. It escalated to the point where he swung at my friend, who barely dodged the punch. Thankfully, someone else had found a security guard who stopped the situation before anyone was harmed, allowing my friends and the girl to leave safely. The girl was still disoriented, so no one could get the full story, but she did say the man had been following her around town all day. The unsettling part is that the bar staff could not legally do more than remove the man once my friends left. One of them called the police and gave a description, but the officers said they could only be on the lookout, so chances are he is still out there and may try this again. Story 16. I moved to another town and was surprised by how many people looked at me as if they already knew me, even though I had never seen them before. Everyone was strangely rude despite everything I had heard about the people there being friendly. I was even greeted with, "Oh no, you again?" at a place I was visiting for the first time. I was looking for a room to rent, and one owner told me he would not rent to me because his co-tenants had seen me following and stalking them. I thought something was seriously wrong with my mental health and wondered if I was doing things and forgetting them. Then I went abroad for 3 months, and nothing strange happened. Everything was normal, and I assumed the odd behavior back home was just some strange local culture meant to push newcomers away. When I returned, I went to a fast food restaurant to leave my curriculum vitae, and the worker told me, "You were here a month ago, and nothing has changed. We are not recruiting." But I had been on another continent. I could not have flown back and forth without remembering, and my bank account would have shown it anyway. That is when I began to understand what was happening. One day I finally saw myself on the closed-circuit television footage trying to steal something. The reactions suddenly made sense. Stealing, following people, stalking, and being disliked. Except it was not me. There was someone who looked exactly like me, down to the hairstyle, which was very common at the time. As of now, I know of at least 2 people who look nearly identical to me. Story 17, I used to run the boilers in a Department of Energy building. Apparently in the 1980s, 3 people were killed over involvement in a major videocassette recorder theft. These machines were meant for the school system and had been stolen from the warehouse in an inside job gone wrong. The head custodian was found shot, and the other 2 people were reported buried in Monticello, but the rumor was that they had first been incinerated. The boilers I operated were the ones supposedly used. There were 3 operational boilers and one that was not in service. I had no idea which one might have been used, but every time I fired them up, and was the only person in the building as usual, I wondered about the history behind them. What truly gave me chills, though, was cleaning them. You have to clean the interiors thoroughly because soot from number 6 oil builds up fast, and poor cleaning prevents the fire from transferring heat efficiently. You have to wear a Tyvek suit, a mask, and climb right into the firebox. I often found myself staring into the burner, wondering what that moment must have felt like for anyone trapped there, though I am fairly sure those involved were already dead. Once I was inside one boiler while another was running, and the valve isolating my boiler from the steam line was not holding. By the time I realized how hot it was getting, I was already panicking. Trying to pull myself up and crawl out through the small opening, the metal was almost too hot to touch. It was a terrifying experience, especially considering the building's disturbing past. Story 18. All right, so my preschool teacher, who later became my 11th grade English teacher, had a remarkably unusual life. Her mother wrote a well-known book, her father worked high up in the government, but that is secondary. She had dark hair and blue eyes, which matters in a moment. She told this story every single year to new students. When she was younger, she was driving through Arizona on a two-way road while her boyfriend was following her on his motorcycle. Certain parts of Arizona are very isolated, and they were on a long drive to a destination they both knew by memory. Eventually, they got separated by a few miles. A man in a Volkswagen Beetle kept pulling up beside her in the other lane and gesturing for her to pull over. She ignored him at first, but he kept doing it and became increasingly frantic. She thought he had spotted something wrong with her car, so when she saw a deserted gas station, she pulled into the lot. The moment she stopped, she felt uneasy. The man insisted her headlight had an issue and told her to get out so he could show her. As she stepped out, her boyfriend finally caught up and pulled into the station. The moment he appeared, the man jumped into his car and sped off. Later, they learned the man was Ted Bundy. She said she often wondered what would have happened if her boyfriend had been even a few more miles behind her. Story 19. 100% true because it happened to me, and although it is more eerie than frightening, you can decide for yourself. Many years ago, before cell phones, we used pagers clipped to our belts. Someone would page you with their number, and you would call back when you reached a phone. I was an on-call technician in the audiovisual field, so my pager went off constantly, but emergency pages marked with a 911 were rare. One afternoon, while driving from Orlando to St. Petersburg on Interstate 4, my pager buzzed with a number I did not recognize, followed by 911. I took the first exit and pulled into a small truck stop near Plant City to use the payphone. It took me about 3 minutes. I got change, walked to the wall where 4 payphones were lined up, inserted a quarter, and dialed the number on my pager. It rang and rang with no answer. Then I realized I heard another ringing besides the one in my ear. I pulled the handset away and saw that a payphone 2 spots down was ringing. I hung up my phone, and the ringing on the other phone stopped. I walked over, picked up the handset, checked the number above the buttons, checked the number on my pager, checked again, and except for the 911, they matched exactly. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I asked the cashier if anyone had used the phones recently, and she said I was the only person in the store for the past hour. I left quickly, still shaken. About 10 miles down the road, I came upon a scene that looked catastrophic. A 4-car crash involving a tractor trailer carrying steel that had come loose. State troopers and paramedics were just arriving. I pulled over and helped as much as I could, but it was clear the damage was already done. I still do not know who paged me or why, but I am convinced that if I had not stopped, I would not be here to tell the story. Story 20. A female friend in college disappeared from a party at another university about 25 miles north of our school. She had arrived with another friend who I believe drove. At some point, she split off to play a game and then vanished. Calls went to voicemail, police were notified, and she was simply missing. About 10 days later, a homeless man found her crawling to a bus stop in the city, begging for help. She had a broken leg, a broken arm, and was in extremely poor condition. At the party, someone had secretly drugged her drink before a group of men led her to their car. She was taken to an apartment, repeatedly assaulted, drugged, and locked in a small room with only a bucket. After being injected with heroin and attacked again, she somehow convinced one of her captors to let her use the actual bathroom. The bathroom had a small window, and with the shower running to cover noise, she squeezed through it and fell from the 3rd story into a large bush. From there, she crawled all the way to the road. A homeless man spotted her and called for help. Several cars stopped, preventing her captors from grabbing her again. 3 men were arrested after surveillance cameras helped police locate the apartment. She returned to our university almost 2 years later, graduated, and became a nurse. She never partied again, carried protection everywhere she legally could, and somehow managed to move forward with her life. She had been an 18-year-old freshman when it happened, and none of us ever forgot it. Story 21. This one terrifies me. I am going to stay vague because I originally thought these events were rare, although many comments have since shown me they are more common than expected. A family acquaintance knew a man whose wife tragically died while taking their dog for a walk in a rural area they were visiting. They had driven to a farm, gotten out of the car, and the dog pulled away, running behind a barn where there was a large open waste cistern used for storing animal runoff. The farmer was not home at the time, so when he later returned and saw a strange car with the doors open and no one nearby, he searched the property. What he eventually found was something I had never imagined. The dog had fallen into the deep liquid waste inside the cistern, and the edges were too high for anything to climb out. The woman must have panicked and jumped in to save the dog, but the fumes produced by the waste were extremely toxic. Unable to escape, she lost consciousness and drowned along with the dog. It was an awful and heartbreaking way to lose a life, and I still think about it sometimes, hoping no one ever experiences something like that again. Story 22. This was not a situation involving a brief attack or a quick crime. Instead, this was a prolonged and extremely cruel case in which 4 individuals kidnapped a young girl in Japan and subjected her to weeks of severe abuse. Over the course of more than a month, she endured repeated assaults, physical torment, exposure to harsh winter conditions, and many other acts meant to harm and degrade her. She pleaded for her suffering to end. Eventually, she passed away from the injuries inflicted on her, and her body was later hidden. The cruelty of the case shocked the country and remains one of the most disturbing crimes ever documented. It is not just a tragic loss of life, but a reminder of how devastating human cruelty can be. Reading about the case is difficult, and even people with a strong tolerance for true crime often find it deeply unsettling. Story 23. I attend a university outside my hometown, so I rent student accommodation throughout the year. My contract ended before my last exam, which was due the following week. I planned to spend the night studying at the 24-hour library, but when I arrived around midnight, I found it closed for emergency maintenance. With nowhere else to go, I searched for a hotel. Most were too expensive, but I found a cheap one and walked about 30 minutes down a long, dark, silent road toward it. When I finally arrived, I felt relieved, thinking I would be safe inside. I stepped into an old Victorian-style building and found no one at reception. After ringing the bell several times, I saw a tall, strange man staring at me from the top of the stairs. When I asked if he worked there, he said he did not and was just a guest, then began asking me many personal questions. I answered vaguely, and he walked back upstairs. I heard loud bangs and shouting from above. Eventually, staff returned and checked me in. As I went upstairs, I heard knocking on the door next to mine and more shouting. Soon after, someone knocked on my door. It was the same man. He asked if I was alone. I told him a friend would be arriving in 5 minutes, which was a lie. He then asked to come inside. I refused, and he tried to force his way in, but I pushed the door shut. After about 10 minutes, he knocked again, but then moved on, likely thinking the voice from the video I was watching was another person. Moments later, I heard loud banging from the next room, followed by screams. I later learned the man was suspected of being a serial offender who had been hiding weapons and intended to harm someone that night. He broke into the room next door and attacked the occupant. Police soon arrived, gathered statements, and the suspect fled. I do not know if he was ever caught. Since then, I have never chosen a cheap hotel again, no matter the price difference. Story 24. My 6th grade social studies teacher once told us the story of how she escaped her father, who had severe mental health issues and became violent. It happened on one of those last days of school when she handed out puzzles instead of teaching. A girl was talking about horror movies, and the teacher overheard and asked if we wanted to hear the story of her father. As bored 6th graders, we all agreed. She explained that her father sometimes snapped due to his illness. One day he lost control, grabbed an axe, and began chopping through her bedroom door. He broke in and was moments away from hurting her when her mother ran in and tackled him. Her mother grabbed the axe, locked herself and the teacher's sister in the bathroom, and held the door shut. The teacher opened her window, jumped out, and ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. She said her father later took his own life after serving time. Hearing this from a teacher we saw every day has stayed with me ever since. Story 25. I was working in a theater a few months ago, cleaning after movies. One night I waited for everyone to leave a theater, and when I thought it was empty, I went in to clean. I was halfway through when I noticed someone sitting at the top row where there were no lights, so I could only see a silhouette. I was creeped out but kept walking up the steps. I told him the movie was over and he needed to leave. He did not respond. The area had a known drug problem, so I got nervous and started heading down to get my manager. But then he said, "You forgot to clean up here." I quickly left and told my manager. We both went back, and the man was gone. I have no idea what he wanted, but it remains one of the creepiest moments I have experienced. Aside from that, I study history, so I know many disturbing historical accounts. One is about Rasputin, who acted almost like a real-life slasher villain. He traveled across Siberia, gained influence over the royal family, convinced Tsar Nicholas II to go to the front lines, began a cult-like following, and was rumored to have harmed members of the royal household. When people finally attempted to kill him, he survived poisoning, being shot, beaten, strangled, and was ultimately found to have drowned after being tied up and thrown into a river. The story has always fascinated and unsettled me. Story 26. While driving from Morelia to Ciudad Hidalgo in Mexico in the 1980s, we had two routes, the National Road or the Old National Road known as Mil Cumbres, meaning 1,000 hills. The road had countless curves and often caused motion sickness. One evening, my grandfather chose Mil Cumbres because he loved the views, even though fewer drivers used it after the new highway was built. It became dark quickly, and the remote mountain road had very little traffic. About 45 minutes into the drive, my grandfather suddenly slowed down. I was in the back seat and leaned forward to see what was happening. That is when I saw a huge tree log blocking the road. My grandfather stopped immediately, reversed quickly, and turned around. As he accelerated, I was pushed back into my seat. I turned around to look and saw men emerging from the trees near the log, holding flashlights and weapons, barely visible in the fading light of our tail lamps. They had clearly set up the blockage to stop cars and rob travelers. Because of my grandfather's fast reaction, we escaped. That was the last time I ever traveled that road. Story 27. In college, I lived in a house with several other students I did not know well at first, but we eventually became close. For spring break, one of my housemates went to Panama with friends I also knew. When she returned, I noticed one of her friends had severe cold sores, which is not unusual in a college environment. A few days later, I asked how the trip went, and she told me something unsettling. They kept running into a local man on the beach who persistently pursued her friend. She eventually flirted with him and let him come up to her room one night. The next time they met, he gave her his information and urged her to spend her last night with him at his place. Thankfully, she did not go. When they returned home, her friend went to the campus clinic because she felt extremely uncomfortable, and her cold sores were worsening. The doctor was shocked and said he had only ever read about the condition she had developed. When asked if she had kissed or been intimate with anyone while traveling, she admitted she had. The condition was a rare form of necrosis documented primarily in cases involving severely unsafe behavior, meaning something extremely abnormal had been transmitted to her. She contacted authorities, and a lengthy investigation followed. When the suspect was found, multiple missing tourists were discovered in his basement. He had been responsible for harming them. The entire situation was horrifying, and her friend had to go through months of treatment and legal proceedings as a result. Story 28. When we were about 14 years old, my cousin had a wildlife camera mounted on a tree near my uncle's small cabin in the woods. The camera would take photos whenever it detected movement, so we checked it every day or so. One weekend we had a family gathering, and because the cabin was small, the kids slept in tents outside. All night we heard strange animal noises coming from the forest, and the younger cousins were frightened enough to go inside. The next day we went hiking and passed the camera, so we checked the latest photos. To our shock, 4 or 5 images showed what looked like a lumberjack holding an axe, wearing a hood with his face completely covered, walking toward the cabin at about 1 a.m. The younger cousins panicked and ran for their parents. The truth was far less frightening. My oldest cousin and I had pranked them. We went into the woods around midnight with a radio and played a sound mix of animal noises we had made from YouTube clips, even though it made no sense because the forest was in the Alps. We also brought an axe and passed in front of the wildlife camera on purpose to stage the eerie photos. It worked a little too well, and our younger cousins did not forgive us for a long time. Story 29. The Van Ornum wagon train consisted of about 45 people traveling to Oregon in 1860. Near what is now Twin Falls, Idaho, they were attacked. One survivor later described how a 12-year-old girl, who had 4 siblings, used an axe to defend herself and the younger children while witnessing the loss of her parents. Many members of the group were killed immediately, and the survivors spent about 45 days on foot, hiding and trading for food, uncertain who was friendly. They eventually reached Farewell Bend in Oregon, where the group split up. Those who remained at the camp eventually died from starvation or were killed, while those who left, including the 12-year-old carrying her baby sister, became so desperate that they resorted to consuming those who had passed away in order to survive. They encountered 2 local men whom they feared might be connected to earlier attacks, but the men signaled that they had fish, likely salmon. The group cautiously sent a 14-year-old boy with them, but he never returned. The survivors continued walking, and after the baby died, they were on the verge of consuming her remains when Marcus Reno, who would later be involved in the Little Bighorn battle, found them and rescued them. Soldiers later discovered remains believed to belong to the missing boy. In the end, only around 15 people survived. Their scouts had abandoned them, leaving them lost and struggling to stay alive in an unforgiving landscape. Story 30. This happened about 9 years ago and is not as intense or dark as many of the stories on here, but here it goes. I've shared it before on another account, and I'll do it again. I was an underground engineer working on large machinery miles below the surface at a mining site. My job was to keep a huge boiler running, one of more than a dozen, each with engineers assigned in shifts. These ran non-stop because they powered not only the mining shafts, but also a large underground town that housed roughly 20,000 people. The boilers broke down constantly, and if more than 4 failed at once, the town's power would be cut to keep the industrial section running. If the industrial section lost power, the air pumps would fail, which would have been fatal, so the pressure was constant. I remember working on those 30-foot-tall boiler stacks and the parts we would craft on the spot just to keep them functioning. No one had been to the surface in decades due to widespread danger, so this was a fully self-contained city with politicians, service workers, teachers, cooks, and every role imaginable. My wife worked at the school where our 3 children studied, and in 3 years Robert would have turned 16 and begun working, while the younger 2 were still small. I remember every street, building, house, and person, down to countless names and personalities. I remember our home, our decorations, the kids' toys, blankets, and beds. I had lived a full life with these people. Then suddenly I woke up, except I had already been awake. I was confused, surrounded by bright white lights instead of the orange lamps we used underground, and familiar faces were asking questions. It turned out I had contracted a severe bacterial infection and had been hospitalized with a fever. I had been unconscious for no more than 4 days. In that time, my brain created an entire life, a family, decades of memories, friendships, jobs, and a whole city. I tried to explain it to my girlfriend, but she focused more on my medical condition, so I never told anyone again. I know many people experience hallucinations, but this felt unbelievably real. It wasn't anything surreal or fantastical. It was 30 years of completely believable memories of a life I never lived. Realizing that it was all a creation of my mind sent me into a depression for a long time, and even after 9 years, parts of the memory still make me feel uneasy. Story 31. There was once an extremely wealthy billionaire whose source of fortune and global connections was unclear, yet he was linked to some of the most influential people on the planet. Over time, it came to light that he had been involved in gatherings where underage individuals who had been exploited were brought to participate in illegal activities. He even had a private airplane nicknamed the Lolita Express, where he and various wealthy individuals would travel with no security oversight, including a former president of one of the world's most powerful nations who reportedly flew with him around 25 times without his usual protective detail. It later emerged that this man owned a private island where vulnerable underage individuals were reportedly taken, and he secretly recorded many high-profile visitors engaging in criminal acts. Instead of using the evidence to bring justice, he allegedly used it for financial blackmail. He was eventually arrested when extensive evidence involving numerous victims was uncovered. However, despite the severity of the crimes, his sentence the first time was very lenient, amounting to around 13 months, during which he had his own private wing, frequent visitors, an unlocked door, and permission to leave for more than 12 hours per day on so-called work release. Years later, when the growing amount of evidence made it impossible for powerful allies to protect him, he was arrested again. The situation escalated, and avoiding accountability seemed unlikely. Then the day before he was scheduled to testify and reveal the names of the influential people involved, he was found deceased in his cell under circumstances ruled as an apparent suicide. Story 32. A while back, a family friend had a trip planned for Mexico. His wife and 3 kids went with him. The trip was going great, but they noticed in the area they were in had stores that were in a straight line and had fence going in between them to form allies where you can open the fence and it leads to the other side of town, essentially, where there are homes and whatnot. Well, he had a young son that was about 5 at the time who wandered to the allies while the family was occupied in a store looking for some essentials. They reported him missing shortly after due to not finding him after a good 2 hours. Now, for some background, if you were not aware, but parts of Mexico are greatly affected by cartels. A couple days later, police found the body of the young boy in a desert a little ways outside of town. His body filled with packages of illegal substances after having some organs removed that took up space in his gut area. He was not meant to be found by police, as it had been later discovered that it was for a customer. I still do not think the family has fully recovered after 3 years of grieving. Story 33. About 4 years ago, I was driving my friend home from an out-of-state karate tournament through the back roads of North Carolina. I mean, absolutely nothing but farmland and woods for miles. It was 2 a.m, but it was a bright moon so you could still see. I turned a corner and a car pulled onto the road behind me. No big deal, but then the car raced up to my bumper and stayed on my back for a couple miles. I figured they would pass me, but they never did. I wanted to go into law enforcement at the time, and my friend was a country girl, so we were both putting on brave faces, but honestly, both of us were terrified. I began taking turns and speeding 70, 80+ miles per hour on cracked concrete roads, hoping I did not hit a deer, and the car behind me never let off and never passed me. We were scared, but time was very real to us, and this guy had been following us so closely and for so long that my nerves began to give out. We considered calling the police, but we were so far out in an unfamiliar area, we had no idea if we could even reach an emergency dispatcher. After 45 minutes of literally speeding for our lives, we began to get close to her house, and I started theorizing what to do when this person pulls into her very long, dark, woodsy driveway behind us. I told my friend I have an ice pick in the glove box and a pocket knife in my purse. We pull up to the last stop sign before her driveway, where the road also splits into 2 lanes, one going to my friend's house and one leading towards our hometown. The car pulls into the turn lane beside me, heading towards town. As they slowly pulled up beside me, I really and truly thought I was about to get harmed. Then I noticed the writing on the car. Story 34. Before my parents had me, they told me the story of the time they saw a horrible car crash. It was a 4-way stop, and they were behind a car. The car stopped and then started to turn left, but a pickup truck came speeding through the intersection, ran the stop sign, and hit the car in front of them. My mom is a nurse, and both of my parents got out of the car to try to help because the car that was hit was completely destroyed. It was 2 young women in their 20s. The guy who hit them was unscratched and completely intoxicated. One of the girls died on impact. The other, my mom did her best until the ambulance could get there. My dad asked what was the liquid pouring from her head. It was the girl's fluid leaking from her skull, and my mom was doing the best to hold everything together because her skull was cracked wide open. She was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital. Worst part was that the driver had connections in the police force and got off with a very minimal sentence. The family of the girl in the passenger seat knocked on my parents' door and asked my parents to testify because they were suing the family of the girl who was driving. My parents refused. Story 35. So this happened about 5 years ago. I was living with my grandmother at the time. Long story why, but the short of it is that I was working during 2 years off before university, and my parents live a 45-minute drive out of the city, and insuring a car and rent is expensive as hell for a 19-year-old guy. So we lived within a few blocks of an absurdly large mall with a very large area surrounding it that has been very slowly getting progressively sketchier. Nothing like assault or anything extreme, but enough. Example. One guy asked me for a smoke, and when I said I did not smoke, and thus did not have one, he started shouting profanities at me and calling me a liar before attempting to follow me home. But nothing compared to what happened one night. My grandma and I were both about to go to bed when there was a knock at the door. Now my grandmother had dementia, and despite the fact that she was super smart and could hide it insanely well, she did some really odd things and was really paranoid. Paranoid enough to make it less of a pain to look out the window to see who it was than to remove the meticulously placed noise barricades from the door and check the peephole. Turns out some strange woman was crouching down in front of the door with a large blunt weapon. I am not sure what it was, but it was similar to a baseball bat. My bedroom was right next to the front door, with a window near the ground. It opened outwards from the bottom from a crank, which meant it did not open very much. The woman tried to force her way in through the window. My grandmother was terrified, but dementia works both ways. It took me 30 seconds to get her to stop trying to approach the woman and get her into her bedroom across the hall. I told her to lock the door and called the police. The woman kept whispering that she was cold and wanted to come inside and sleep. It took me yelling that I would cut her hand off if she did not retract it to get her to go away, and she still walked around the house for an hour after that, trying all the windows. My grandmother did in fact call the police, but they never came. Story 36, I was responsible for opening a new office for a previous employer. The receptionist that we hired was this sweet little old lady who would always bring in cookies and brownies. Like almost every day, she said her husband had a sweet tooth and she did not know how to make just enough for the two of them. So since the kids all moved out, she always baked too many. She would always tell us funny stories about what her husband said or did the night before. He sounded like a fun guy and she was the absolute sweetest little old lady. Or so I thought. A few months later, her husband was reported missing by her adult kids. They said that he had not called them since Christmas and that their mom was very evasive when they would ask to talk to him on the phone. After a little investigating, the police found the husband, cut into pieces, in this sweet little old lady's trunk. It turns out on Christmas night, she harmed him in his sleep, used a hacksaw to dismember him, rolled all the pieces up in a carpet, and tucked him into her trunk. Here is the creepy part. We hired her in June. They found the body in August. The whole time I knew her, his body was wrapped in a carpet in her trunk. She was bringing in cookies and telling us funny gym stories, all the while he was decaying in her trunk. Story 37. This happened to my mom a few years after she came to Los Angeles from Mexico in the 1970s. She started telling me this story at the age of 10 as a cautionary tale to show me that we cannot ever fully trust other people, even close friends or family. A woman from work at the Omni Hotel where they worked as cleaners had become her close friend and used to show her around the city. Her friend was very accommodating, and since my mom was lonely and did not have any family in this country, she took all the help that she could get. This was despite some misgivings she had about her new friend. The friend was a serious kleptomaniac and would steal things from work, from convenience stores, from clothing stores, and my mom even suspected that she stole some jewelry and perfume from her own apartment. The friend also had this boyfriend who was a huge sexist, misogynistic man who would make my mom feel uncomfortable. He would stare and leer at my mom. This guy was serious trouble and had committed a few robberies without getting caught. He also carried a gun everywhere with him. Anyway, the friend continued to ingratiate herself with my mom. She was fun, helpful, and those were things that my mom craved as a new immigrant in the city. One night, the friend and her boyfriend invited her to come along to a restaurant. They ate, and nothing seemed amiss. Later that night, they drove around for a while and decided to get some donuts. They parked and the girlfriend left to go buy the donuts. The friend was taking long, and my mom began to get nervous. What happened next was that the guy tried to assault my mom. The friend came back and found them, but did not seem surprised. She just laughed and told my mom to calm down. My mom managed to get away from them and ran in the dark through downtown Los Angeles. She moved from the apartment she was living in a few weeks later because she was afraid those two would show up. My mom's friend never showed up to work after that, so it seems like the friend had befriended my mom in order to exploit her and hand her over to her boyfriend. Story 38. Best friend of mine had her iPhone hacked back in 2010. She did not think anything of it until years later, in 2016, when she Google image searched a photo of her, published in a literary magazine, and several image board threads popped up. The same guy had been posting her image searching for private photos, writing super crude comments, and distorting her images to make her look nude. 3 more years of helpless internet searching later, she received a frantic call from her younger sister. The sister discovered an enormous stash of voyeuristic photos, videos, passwords, and pictures of her personal items that had been sexualized on her husband's laptop. Among the videos was one of her getting in and out of the shower on a family vacation, and another of him behaving inappropriately with her underwear. He later admitted that he had been stalking her for over 10 years. The sister and wife also discovered pictures and videos of her friends, of random women in public, in clubs, and of women on the beach during their honeymoon. My friend took evidence that she had collected over the years, but her sister went back to the husband very quickly since they got together when she was 19, and she had been groomed by him for years. The family turned against my friend, and the police are still looking into the matter. Meanwhile, he is a doctor now. They are still married and have a baby on the way. Story 39. Kinda late, but here is my story anyway. I live with my mother, just the two of us in a rather large house. One night I woke up at 3 in the morning because I could hear someone sobbing outside my room, and I knew something was wrong, but I stayed quiet and kept listening. It was my mother, and she was saying, "Please go away," very softly while crying, because she did not want to wake me. Then I heard male voices and realized it was a home invasion. I had to decide within seconds whether to go outside my room and confront the intruders, which would clearly be a bad idea since I was unarmed, or escape through the window and ask for help. The second option meant leaving my mother on her own, but I believed it was the right choice, so I climbed out the window and ran to get the neighbors. As soon as I got out, one of the guys who was waiting outside in their car spotted me, so he called his companions and they all drove off as fast as they could because I had already alerted the neighbors and the police. Even though nothing happened to my mom, I still feel terrible, and the thought of leaving her alone really haunts me. But I am certain it would have been worse if I had left my room and confronted them. Story 40. I had a super cute, extremely loving friend. She was genuinely one of the most caring people I have ever met. We will call her Rachel. I always had a crush on her and we texted and talked on the phone, but that is beside the point. Rachel's mom owned a little shop in the same small strip I worked at, right next door to the shop where I worked. She and her mom were always stopping by to chat with us, myself and the people at the shop. Rachel had a brother, we will call him Tony. Rachel was around 20 years old. Tony was around 13. Tony even interned at the shop where I worked for a little bit. He was extremely intelligent for his age, mild-mannered and soft-spoken. One night I got the news soon after it happened. Rachel was downstairs watching television in their house. Tony walked down the stairs, pulled out a pistol, and shot Rachel multiple times. He then began to walk upstairs where he was planning to harm both his parents, but his dad managed to wrestle the gun from his hands before anything else happened. Tony later said he did not know why he harmed his sister. His eyes were emotionless. He was unapologetic. Now his parents have a daughter who is gone and a son on trial. It was surreal that she was there one day and gone the next. It breaks my heart. Rachel was an incredible person, and she is missed by many.